Good morning. I thought I'd start by just reflecting maybe a little bit on yesterday, because I'm going to talk to you a little bit about funding long-term care. But before I do that, I think it's important to think about why would you want to fund long-term care? What are you trying to achieve? And I guess that's a fundamental question before we sort of engage with some of the issues about, well, what kind of financing system do we have, and have we enough money? What kind of financing system do we need? So I just thought I'd reflect a little bit about yesterday, what struck me yesterday about the world we live in, the ageing world we live in. So I'm going to spend about 2 or 3 minutes on that, and then I'm going to go through the presentation. So one of the things that struck me immediately sitting down there at the back was how wonderful it is to be alive, in the sense that, nowadays, if you look at the data from yesterday, 637,000 older people over 65. We've got a 4-year life expectancy gains in the last 20 years. So it's 21 years and 18 years. That's an increase of 4 years. So in 1996, you would be living 4 years less on average if you were 65 years of age. So these are really significant gains. There are also other significant gains. If you listened yesterday to the HSE, to Pat Healy, and listen to him talk about the HSE. We have a lot of sort of good policy in place. We've done a lot of things over the last number of years in terms of making it easier for people to funding for long-term care. There's certainly a lot of programs and plans in place for older people. So there is a commitment, I'd say, in the system. I've worked in this area for 30 years. If I gave this talk 30 years ago, it would be a very different talk. So there's been a change over the last 30 years in terms of a commitment to older people. In particularly, we haven't got home care right yet. We know that from yesterday, for sure, and I'm going to be repeating this morning. But I think it's worthwhile to think also about the gains in terms of the position of older people in society. In a sense, we're going to talk about, by and large, funding for long-term care, but there's a whole world out there of people of older people who don't need long-term care right now. The vast majority of older people are participating in society, are contributing hugely in terms of transfer of resources, time resources, financial resources. They're engaging in communities, that are leading communities. So the world out there for older people is a world, potentially a world, should be a world, and certainly we're not there, of opportunity. The word I think about when I think about older people, and when I begin to think about a funding system, is capabilities. That's the word I use. How can I maximize capabilities of a person? That's the way I look on the contribution. How can we organize a system, not just of care, but a system of opportunity, of engagement, so that maximizes life opportunities? I was struck yesterday by another comment as well, which talked about age and the difficulty of compensating in older age for some of the inequalities that existed in earlier life, and the need for that we don't pin everything on sort of age system. There are inequalities. We take those inequalities with us. And I think when we think about aging, we should think about a life course, and we should think about engagement, because bear in mind, if we look at mortality rates, for example, there are many people who don't reach older age simply because of health inequalities, who simply don't reach 65. So, when we think about age, we shouldn't be bounded by thinking only of long-term care and funding long-term care. We should think about the totality of aging and when aging begins and what we expect from aging. And it's that expectation I want to talk about today when I talk about the long-term care system. What it is about that system, that we want. If I gave you a blank sheet of paper, like a Rawlsian piece of white paper, and said, what principles should underpin long-term care? What's the first word you'd put down on that? Would it be autonomy? Would it be choice? Would it be some sense of equality? What are the words you would use for your long-term care system? So before we begin to start teasing out and begin to say, well, what does Germany spend on long-term care? What do the Netherlands spend? We need to think about what is good for us. What do we want from age and aging? What is it we want from our own? And that is much greater than simply long-term care. Simply want to make that point. They embrace this, the engagement of older people, the participation of older people, the leadership of older people, and the huge commitment that older people are making. Those numbers I talked about at the start in terms of the sort of population life expectancy gains, they are a massive cause of celebration. Somebody asked yesterday, why are they happening? Well, they're happening because of obviously health gains in terms of medical technology gains, particularly in the area of cardiovascular disease, but they're also happening because of economic and social development. There are elements of that too that are impacting really positively on our ability to live longer. So these are really positive gains. So before we begin to sort of tease out technically some of the issues I'm going to talk about, it's really useful to remember, the time we're living in. Now, we have important policy challenges ahead. And this is a really good opportune time for us to think about these policy challenges. These policy challenges are partly related to age, to the demographic data we had yesterday. We know that Ireland is a relatively young country. It's getting older. But the good news is many countries have got older before us. The median age of countries has increased in other places, and the sky did not fall in. So we're not talking about some vision of the future that is in some sense, will sometimes damage or potentially damage the economy. This has happened before in other countries. So we just need to think our way through it. And we have less time now than we had 20 years ago. Or 10 years ago, but we still have time to really make our mark in terms of what we want. And the final point is this preamble. I think it's important, is we can choose culturally the way we think about age and aging, the way we want our society to be organised for age. We can make really good choices as to what the role and position of older people are in our society, not just in nursing homes, not just in home care, but in their general contribution and participation in society. These are choices that we can make, but like all choices, they have consequences. And the consequences may well be that it requires to find additional funding or new ways of thinking about things, or combating regulation and legislation to combat ageism, to really challenge this society to live where being an older person makes no difference. The chronological age, simply makes no difference to opportunity. So that's my preamble, but I think it's a necessary preamble because I'm an economist. People usually write you off really quickly and say, well, he's here to talk about costs and so on and finance. And I think an economist does that, but I think the public policy question is much wider. The public policy question is a socio-political, socio-cultural, socio-economic exploration of what citizens and what the public want to engage with. So, if I could, technology. So, I'm going to talk about funding long-term care. And by long-term care, sometimes people think about long-term care as meaning only residential care or care in nursing homes. Long-term care for me means care anywhere it's given. Whether it's given in the community, whether it's given in respite care, daycare, residential care, nursing homes, public or private, it's how we think about funding long-term care. Because from yesterday, it seems like, the message coming back is resources are scarce. Choices have to be made. So that begs the question, how do we get more resources into the system? Okay? A few things have been happening in recent years that's worth mentioning. First of all, I just have a table here. It's in the paper. Not everything I'm saying here is in the paper. The paper is more formally presented. This is slightly different. It covers 80-90% of the paper. So one of the things that you've noticed here on the column, these are years as you look at it on the left, and then you have the spending on older people. It's sometimes quite difficult to get this data, but you see the spending has been up and down since 2009, between 2011. We all know that there was austerity. We all know that public expenditure was under pressure. We all know during that time as well that the number of older people in the country was going up. Okay, and a recent census, as we said, showed something like 637,000 older people over 65. If you look at the column on the right, I simply divided the expenditure by the numbers of older people. And you'll notice if you look at the column on the right, the per capita, which means spending per person age 65 and over, that means anybody age 65 and over, is going down. So things are happening. When you look at the data on expenditure, some of that is related to austerity, yeah, and some of that is related to the priority setting process. And this is one of the questions I addressed earlier, sort of the role and position of older people in society and their place in the priority or the prioritization process. How is the available resources divvied out across healthcare, divvied out across education, welfare? Where do older people stand in that? That's a really important question that we don't know that much about, how this gets done. But we do know the figures tell you a story there in terms of expenditure. Somebody asked the question yesterday, just how do Ireland rate with respect to spending overall across Europe, in terms of GDP? I think somebody mentioned Holland. Holland spend the most, about 4.2% of GDP. Ireland spend about 1.8% of GDP. The OECD average is about 1.4% of GDP. So we spend a little bit above the OECD, which is a collection of basically industrialized countries, sort of relatively well-off countries. Yeah, Ireland spend a little bit above the average. At the other end of the extreme, then you have countries like Poland and Greece who spend very, very little, a tiny 0.1, 0.2% of GDP. So we stand a little bit above the middle. Now, question, is that good or bad? Is it good that we spend that much or is it bad that we spend that much? The answer is, it depends on my preamble. What sort of country do you want? What sort of expenditure do you want? What tax are you willing to bear? Are you willing to pay additional resources or social insurance to fund the system that you want? Holland, the Netherlands has a social insurance system, yeah, along with Germany, but the Netherlands choose to fund their system different than our system. I'm not saying right now what's good or bad. I'm simply saying, these are the choices we make, and they have implications for what we do. Some of this data on expenditure by country comes with health warnings because you don't always know what people are spending on in terms of health and social care, and they're not always comparative. But look, they're a good indication of spending. I'll just give you an indication of the home market, because I think yesterday we realised that an important thing. One, that the nursing home subvention scheme, or so-called fair deal scheme, tends to dominate statutorily. It's dominated. It's defined by statute. People have certain rights subject to significant cost sharing, and we saw yesterday that home care doesn't have the similar type of statutory or legislative basis. Yeah, that's an important thing that came through yesterday, I think. I just thought I'd put up a slide on the home care market, and you can see it's about, it fluctuates about 0.4 of a billion. Is that for 214? Yeah, 0.345. It's a little bit more now, maybe heading towards 0.5 of a billion. It's less than spent on residential care. But it's interesting. I just put up the slide because it's interesting, and I say interesting because it's interesting for thinking about the future. One of the things that happens with those cutbacks yesterday, that I saw on the previous slide, when I said expenditure is going down over the time, one of the things that happens in austerity is that the tendency is to cut services that don't have a statutory base. So if you think about it, the first thing that gets cut is, well, do we have to provide it? No. Yeah? Is it in some sense fragmented or tangential? Yes. So maybe that's the best place to go. So there is a tendency for us to focus on the statutorily supported services. So that tends to happen when cutbacks have to be made. Also, fixed costs, pay costs are fixed costs, so therefore it's very difficult to cut back pay. I'm not suggesting it should happen, but if that were a choice, it's not really there, because so much amount of care is provided by people, yeah, and you have to have people to provide care. So one of the things that happens in home care is that you get rationing. Significant rationing. Services aren't provided. We talked yesterday, for example, about 55,000 people with dementia in the country. We don't know that for sure because we don't have prevalence studies, but there are around 55,000 people with dementia. We don't really know how many of those are engaged in the community care system. significant numbers don't receive any care, I would suggest. Yeah? So part of the thing then is you get rationing in community care. The end result of that, and increasingly in my view, will be the development of private home care markets. The figure on the slide suggested we spend 20 million privately out of pocket. People simply pay privately. This is not the HSE contracting with a private provider to provide. It's people saying, I want to pay out of pocket. The likelihood is, as income per capita increases, that we'll find increasingly private expenditure on home care provision. Now, I'm not at the moment saying this is good or bad. I'm simply saying this is a potential trend that if you don't fund long-term care in the community, if it comes under pressure, if income per capita is increasing, if people have the resources, those who can pay will pay. The danger of that, of course, is that those who can pay will exit and those who can't pay will stay. And we've seen before where people exit a public system, there is a danger of differential standards, differential care, and so on. All I'm doing is simply telling a story that potentially could happen. So I thought it's also interesting to say that we just didn't arrive at this point in whatever year we're in, thinking about this for the first time. We've been thinking and writing about this for a long time. Probably the first major reform was back in the 1960s, where we had the Care at the Age report. You know that traditionally, Ireland care of older people was through institutional care, residential care. Those of you who are old enough as I am to remember the county home, the big building, and people tended to go to these county homes and so on like that. The 60s began the process of thinking slightly differently about care of older people, but it's been a painful process, painfully slow process. It's been full of promise and less so on delivery, particularly for home care. The 1988 the Years Ahead report began the whole element of community orientation. We wanted to move to community, and this is a well-felt, genuine belief across the socio-political system of wanting to move towards a home care system. We talked even at that stage about community hospitals and the need to have sort of a long-stay facilities which be engaged with communities of which it was in, inward, outward communities coming in, families engaged in care, even when people were in long-stay care. Yeah. So part of that was certainly a huge mind shift in terms of the system. Unfortunately, we didn't tend to follow that with resources. We didn't tend to put the resources into community-based care. So to deliver the system that we all said we wanted, it has proven really difficult, really difficult to get that system of care. In the meantime, we came up with the Health Nursing Homes Act for the sort of expansion of nursing home care, private nursing home care in particular. That led to a sort of change in structure of care. We used to be mainly public beds. Now we're mainly private beds. It used to be, and these figures are aggregate, it used to be 80-20 public, now it's probably 80-20 private. And that also then was developed through the Nursing Home Support Scheme, the Fair Deal Scheme, which sought to sort of regularise financing of long-stay care in nursing homes. And more recently then we've had the National Dementia Strategy, and listen to these principles for the National Dementia Strategy. The two fundamental principles for the National Dementia Strategy in Ireland are a cause for celebration. They are a principle of personhood and a principle of citizenship. Now these principles, if we managed in some way to deliver on those principles, we would have a dementia care system that would be first rate in any comparison across the world, if we could deliver on those two, personhood and citizenship. So the policy framework, in a sense, exists. This is, you don't find these principles, not many countries have dementia strategies anyway, and those principles, if we lived them, would be transformative. And that's a real challenge, what I'm going to say. So we do have policy documents, and we do have a commitment. And everywhere I go, and I've been going into practice of nursing homes, community care, with policymakers, with advocacy groups, there is, in some sense, a shared commitment We simply, though, have not been able to deliver in terms of getting what we all seem to want to happen. Okay, so I'm going to run out of time. So you heard a lot about the fair deal scheme yesterday. So I'm not going to get in much to sort of again the mechanics of it. It's significant cost sharing. It was done to regularise a system of care, a system of funding which was certainly inequitable. It has a contribution. It costs just under $1 billion. It was reviewed in 2005 because of sustainability concerns. People were wanted to enter the scheme but couldn't enter the scheme because of funding, and certainly that's been addressed to some extent. The waiting lists are now down. But look, given the numbers we talked about yesterday, given the numbers of people, older people who may be in need of long-term care, there will be sustainability issues in the future. That is a fact. Even if we wanted to spend billions more on community care, we'd still need to fund residential care because of the numbers. So we just need to be careful. So we talked the advantages. It's statute-based, it's certainty, transparency, it gives an element of choice, it gives an element of market stability. Nursing homes knows they're going to get paid, for example, and it also delivers equity within the age cohort. It used to be the case prior to the Nursing Home Subvention Scheme, for example, that if you ended up in a public long stay bed in the 90s, you didn't have to pay as much as you ended up in a private bed. You would be charged more in a private bed. You could have the same means, you could be the same age, you could have the same disease, dementia, for example, but you'd have to pay more in the private bed. No wonder there were challenges. No wonder the ombudsman got involved in these cases about whether there were right to care and whether those rights to care were exercised or properly funded, for example. So the old system certainly was one that had to be changed. And the Fair Deal has delivered a certain degree of stability in the market. There are those who object to the Fair Deal scheme for very good reason. For example, the significant amount of cost sharing. There's a lot of bureaucracy. Because there's a lot of issues, for example, to do with property. This is not something that one can do easily, but it's certainly, we've seen needs to be simplified. There is a residential bias. One of the things that, for example, entry to the Fair Deal scheme does is it gives you certainty. If I'm looking after my mum, and I think about, well, what's going to be the future 6 months here with community care? I may think, well, will I get what I need here? Will I get the services I need? What if my mum gets progressively worse? Will I be able to continue caring? There's a degree of uncertainty, which there isn't, of course, with to do with a residential bed. There are lots of other issues. I'm just simply saying there is a degree of certainty about when you have a funding system for residential care and when the funding system is less than complete for the community care system and certainly not statutorily provided. So, you get these little behavioural prompts, and I think if we were serious about community-based care, they would be operating in the opposite direction. If we were serious about community-based care and home care, we would have all the behavioural prompts, all the incentives saying, you know what, we're going to give you better incentive to stay at home, than enter into residential care. These are the way that policy can affect our decision making, but they do require significant choices to be made with respect to the funding system that we have and the incentive system that we have. So, home care then, so the Fair Deal is essentially confined to residential care. We know that the government at the moment are thinking about a home care bill to try to put legislative basis for a home care system. I talked about the uncertainty of the community-based funding. There is a significant amount of unmet need in the community. I work all the time now in dementia. I referenced it earlier. We haven't really dealt with the level of unmet need in the community. We saw yesterday our reliance on the family care system. Now, here's an interesting question as well, and it goes back to, again, my preamble. So, I've written there reliance on family care. So the question is this good or bad? Do you want this system? Do we want a system of reliance on family care? Or do we have a system saying, no, I don't want families involved at all? Because the answer to that question does determine the funding issues and the provision issues. So in a sense, that question about family responsibility, which, for example, in Germany, they have a long-term care insurance system, their commitment to family responsibility is explicit. Yeah? How explicit is our commitment to family care? Does it need to be explicit? Is this something that's sort of culturally ingrained in it that said, families should care, families have responsibility, or is it something we should make explicit? What is it that we demand of family carers? A real question for us in terms of, addressing the sort of funding issues. The other question about community-based care, it's a largely supply-driven model. So what do I mean by that? Well, largely, the decisions are made primarily by providers. So the time you get your care, the type of care you get, is largely driven by what's funded, what's available during certain times, and very rarely, well, that's unfair, sometimes older people are not engaged in decisions about their own care. I know most about dementia nowadays. So, with cognitive impairment, my view is that people with dementia should be directly involved in making decisions. So if I want a particular form of care, if I want more psychosocial care, if I want more sort of community-based engagement rather than, say, home care, then that's what I should get in my view. So the notion of personhood that I talked, for example, in dementia means that the primacy of the person with dementia is central to decision making. So going back to when I asked you, what would your first principle be with respect to the type of care system you wanted? And I said, well, would it be autonomy? Would it be choice? For me, I would simply like to be autonomous and have choice, including choice in terms of what services I get. So these are important questions, and they change the game. If you move from a supply-driven model to a consumer, and I use the word consumer, a person-driven model, it's a very different system, and with very different implications for funding. So personalized care is only developing. So do you want generic care given, or do you want personalized care? To get personalized care, we have to ask you more. If you have personalized care, we need to regulate it more. To regulate it more, we need to know what outcomes matter. So we've got to ask you a lot more questions than we're asking now in terms of the system. So in general, the social model is weaker. And yet it's the social model sometimes that defines us. If I was to ask you, what is it about your life that matters? Most of us would say it's our communication, it's our interaction, it's our engagement with communities, it's what we do with our families, it's what I love doing. Why should we stop what we love doing simply because we're older and have a disability? So the social model is one where in a sense, innately, it's something we know. It's something we believe in. It's something we embrace. Why can't we have it in the social care system that we want to fund? Going back to my question, what is it you want to do? What is it you want to do here with a social care system in terms of these choices? So, excuse me. So the question about what older people want, well, actually, it's probably not that much, and I think information is a real key, which doesn't cost very much, but we can't seem to get out information as quickly as we should. So, for example, with regard to dementia, post-diagnostic supports, we need to get information out there quickly about the disease. We need to get information on what supports are available, public, private, voluntary, social, medical, all of these things that happen. Good information and quick information. We need the element of choice, autonomy, engagement, personalized care, individualization of care, really, really important. What is it that works for you? What is it that works for you? And where does it work for you? and who's engaged in that training. Integrated care. One of the key elements is, sometimes older populations have comorbidities or multimorbidity, and care requires to be integrated. Why is it so difficult to integrate care to make sure that to make sure that the things we want happen at the right time in the right place? Particularly in the relationship between acute care, community-based care, home care, and so on. Family involvement. Certainly, it seems to me that, going back to my earlier question, people do want families to be involved. The question is, how much? How much should we expect? How much do we expect? How much should we expect? What's our expectations? But families are important here still. And I think it's how we integrate family care and so on. Above all, and this goes back to the broader question. This is not a question about dependence. This is not a question about disability. This is a question about the opportunity to live well. It's no more or no less than that. It's a question about how do we organize care, social system, social provision, community engagement to live well. And that is for any stage of an illness, whether you're at end-stage dementia, whether you've just been diagnosed, whether you've had a stroke, we need the opportunity to continue to live. That, again, goes back to what do you want to achieve here. So I think you should have principles. Now, as it's very difficult to set up principles that everybody agree with, so these are mine, okay? So I'm sure you have principles, and I try not to provide any normative indication of what I want here, because I want to try to be fair. So I think the care requirement should determine funding, not funding. Simply because nursing homes are funded doesn't mean that you have to end up there. Care requirement should determine funding. So simply having a pot of money that says, you know what, if you do these tests and dependency tests and so on, you might qualify for the nursing homes prevention scheme. We need to think about what do you need first, and then say, how do we fund it? Rather than, we have a way of funding this, which then pushes you in a certain direction. Yeah? So care requirements should determine funding. I think if we really want to do what we say we want for the last 40 years, 30 years or so, we need to bias our system towards community-based care. We need to bias the system towards home care. Yeah? So we need to have incentives, nudges, whatever it takes. Whether that means, co-payment for residential care, no co-payment for community-based care. I'm not saying that should be it. I'm simply saying we should have a bias. Whether it means that we simply say, before you can apply for residential care, you exhaust, I don't mean you, the older person, we exhaust all possibilities for home care. We simply do not admit a person to long-stay care, to residential long-stay care, unless we have exhausted every potential avenue. Now, that's going to cost. Somebody asked yesterday, is community care cheaper? Community care is cheaper when you don't count family care. Community care, even, however, if you leave out family care, if we want to provide really high-level community-based care, it's not cheap, nor should it be, if we want to achieve what we want to achieve. Yeah? Now, there are things we can do that don't cost any money at all. Much money like integrated care, more focused on community-based activities, and so on. Or it doesn't cost much money, community-friendly towns and so on like that. So all of those things can happen. But we have got to get, if we want home care, it's going to provide. So funding should be biased. I believe that access to public resources is important, and I believe it should be on the basis of need. It shouldn't be on the basis of ability to pay, and it shouldn't be on the basis of geographical idiosyncrasies, simply where you live. It should be on the basis of need, and resources should be available. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be cost sharing in there, but it should be minimal. Again, this is a view that I have about access to resources. So we should, but that's not going to be cheap to provide that. And the final one, which we have got now, is we've got a common assessment tool to make sure that people are treated the same relative to need. So these are important elements of principle. So I'm nearly there. I'm not sure where I am in my time, but I'm nearly there. I'm heading towards the final stretch. So I just put 5 financing options there. You'll probably be surprised to see the first financing option is family. But that's de facto what's happening. The other one is the market. We could leave all this to the market, of course. We could simply say, so, older age, we know we're going to get older. Yeah, we know that some of us may have some sort of dependency. Why not leave it to the market? People can pay out of their pocket, and so on like that. Or we could say, why not take out private insurance? Again, these are certainly there's a certain amount of risk that can be calculated here. So why not take out private insurance and simply say, like everything else, like car insurance, house insurance, take out private insurance, and that'll handle all your long-stay care bills later on. The other one is general taxation, which we're used to, and the other one is social insurance. I want to talk very briefly about all of those. So you heard a figure yesterday of roughly 1.9 billion, just under 2 billion for dementia, the cost of illness. Well, we did that calculation. So about half that calculation is family care. So when we count all the hours that families do, and we add them up, families are providing about half that 2 billion, in terms of family care. So we are relying significantly on families to provide care. And this is a question, the whole question of family responsibility. I go back to, I just simply leave it to you for discussion about is this freely chosen or is it compulsory? What element is freely chosen and what element is compulsory? If you're giving 24 hours round-the-clock care, it may be that after 8 hours, you begin to think, 8 hours is okay, but 10 hours is 12 hours, 24 hours is different. So, even the best of us, and even the best of people who are giving huge commitment to care and get huge benefits from caring, as we saw yesterday, there certainly are issues about the amount of time people are engaged in care. And there is a certain, as I said, mutuality. There are benefits here. There are maybe socio-cultural reasons why we want this to happen. There are interdependencies in life. There are intergenerational relationships that we value. There is reciprocity that's critical to our well-being, our sense of decency. There is a case of simple love, emotional support that we value. All of these are absolutely important in these relationships and have to be teased out in terms of our commitment here, and so on. But, there are also longitudinal issues. If you're caring for 10 years, it does take something out of you as well as give something to you. And we need to have the support structures around to allow people to do the level of care that they want to do. Because I am certain that many people want to care, but it's a case of what level of supports are there for them. So private markets, one of the things that we saw earlier in the slide, you remember I put up a slide there for 2014 and I said there was 20 million out of pocket spent. I think those numbers are going to go up. Is there anything wrong with this? On a normative way, you can say, well, what's wrong with this? If people want to pay out of pocket and can afford to, why not? And there's nothing wrong with that. The difficulty is that, if we're cutting back on particularly home care services, and I don't mean cutting back because sometimes you get this view that there's somebody there deciding on home care, we're cutting back. It's simply if public finances means that and austerity means that cutbacks have to happen. As I said, the tendency is to go after things that are non-statutory because it's easier. But if they happen, if public resources are less, particularly if numbers start to increase in the future, one of the difficulties is that you'll end up with a two-tier system. You'll end up with a private home care market for people who are well off and a private home care market for people who are not well off. Again, these are choices. These are not things that simply happen. These are choices that face us as citizens and as communities, as taxpayers, in terms of what we want. Also, one of the nice things about private home care, private markets, is you get to see what people want. So, people may pay for things that they like doing, going to football matches, going to music, going to choirs. There are things that maybe aren't provided by the formal system of care. I'm not saying they should have to pay. I'm simply saying you always reveal, when money is involved, people tend to reveal their preferences really, really tightly. about what they really value. I talked earlier about the equity issue and the public-private mix. You know, we have a public-private mix in relation to acute care. What type of public-private mix do we want with respect to social care? Private insurance has failed to develop even in highly competitive market economies like the US. The private insurance market in the US is somewhere about less than 7 or 8%. So almost no country has private insurance developed. Part of the reason for that is most of us are in denial about aging, really from an early age. So we tend to be myopic. We tend to say, well, you know, that's for the future. I'm just starting work here. I'm in my 20s. I can't see myself growing old anytime soon. So therefore, we don't tend to take out private insurance until we come to an age when somebody says, I should be doing something about private insurance for my long-term care. It's too late. The premiums are too high. The cost sharing is too high. So we tend to be myopic. We tend to not think about it. So it becomes an affordability thing. And the products tend to be designed for residential care because they can be more tightly controlled with respect to residential care. Insurance companies can control access. They find it difficult to control community-based care, but they can control residential care. There are information deficiencies as well, and there's also adverse selection. Adverse selection is where people who are more likely to use long-term care buy private insurance. If they're more likely to use it, the costs are likely to be higher. So you've got adverse selection. So the general taxation system is the one that we have. This is, of course, a well-developed, well-founded measure. Structures are easy for collection. Administration costs are there. There's a broadness of the tax base, you know, property taxes, indirect taxes, income taxes, they're all there. And it goes into a pool, it's democratically accountable, and it has a certain amount of universality. The difficulty is priority setting. The difficulty is we're competing for these funds across not just within health, not just within ageing, but within the whole social budget of governments. Not only with the whole social budget of governments, with the whole economic and social budgets of governments. So where does age and older people fit into that? A thing we didn't talk about today, for example, and I'm not going to address it in any great length here because it's a different talk, is the whole question of ageism. How do we know that the allocation process, the priority process, setting process, isn't impacted by ageism? Saying, well, you know, you've had a fair innings, you reach a certain age, we really, you know, you look at this investment, you look at sort of a quality adjusted life years, length of life, you know, maybe we need to allocate that money somewhere else. So we don't know that for sure, but we do know, for example, there is a degree of ageism and discrimination in some healthcare markets with respect to older people. But one of the points I want to make here for this talk is that although taxation has been certainly, you know, obviously incredibly important, it hasn't delivered for home care in particular. For some reason, we haven't managed to get funding through the taxation system to trickle down to the day-to-day lives of older people living in communities, in their own homes, with significant need. Now, whether that's simply a matter of we haven't been fighting hard enough, or there's a degree of ageism in place, or lobby groups have managed to divert funds, I can't answer that question now. I'm simply saying we haven't managed to do it. There are other models. I think social insurance is a way of maybe thinking about this issue. Social insurance is where we'd simply pay 1% extra tax designated to long-term care. We'd start paying it immediately we start work. It would go into a fund and it would act like PRSI. Workers now would fund the long-term care needs of people now, and that would go on. We'd simply pay an extra 1% employers, an extra 1% employees. It would go into a designated fund. It would be transparent. It would be accountable. It would be designated. There would be risk pooling. It would be slightly lower than the tax base because it wouldn't bring in property taxes, VAT and stuff like that. It would be a lifetime contribution. It would be a strong signal of reciprocity and solidarity. Now, going back to where I began this talk, so what is it you want from your long-term care system? What is it you want to show as important values? So do you want to think a decent society should have strong intergenerational, strong reciprocity, strong values of some sense of relationship between young and old, between you now and you in the future, between you now and your children, between your children in the future and their children. What sort of relationship do we want to build in terms of a funding model in terms of a long-term care system? Netherlands has a social insurance system. Germany has one since 1995. Japan has one. They're all slightly different. And Korea have a social insurance system. So there are models there. The problem, of course, is, are you willing to pay additional taxation? And what's the impact of that on competitiveness? For example, when this was last looked at by Mercer, the Mercer report in 2002-ish, I've referenced it in the paper. They looked at social insurance. They thought it was interesting. They did some calculations as to what it might cost. At that time, a 1% increase for employees would generate something just under or just around 0.7 billion. But it had competitiveness issues, labour market issues. None of us like paying more taxes. And, it would be brave to think about a system. It would also be a departure and so on. But it certainly carries some advantages. Now, issue of co-payments. So co-payments is where, no matter what system, you have to pay something out of pocket. So a co-payment would be you have to pay, some part of your pension goes on the payment, or you have to pay, as in the fair deal, part of your assets are taken into account. Most systems, even social insurance systems like in Holland, they have co-payments, 10%, up to 10% co-payments. Most systems, general taxation, social insurance, have co-payments. Co-payments are a way of generating resource. That's what they do. They then, however, tend to have impacts, maybe some unintended consequences, particularly if they start increasing. So the difficulty with cost sharing and co-payments is they may start small and grow large. And then the co-payment is almost the way of financing the system rather than the insurance system or the taxation system. And that's what you have to be careful with. But nearly all systems has some sort of co-payments, some sort of cost sharing relation to income, that the more higher your income, the more you have to pay, etc. Yeah? So they're part of most systems. But they do provide incentives. They can be used to nudge people in a particular direction. I would like to see is nudging people more in the way of staying at home, nudging people in the way of supporting community-based initiatives, having local authorities directly involved in community-based systems, bringing equality and egalitarianism into local authority decision-making and HSE decision-making. Because I'm giving this talk as if there was just one older person. There is not a generic older person. There is a lifetime of equality and inequality arrives at 65. We don't all arrive at 65 in the same condition. It's really important to remember that. And we have then perhaps, maybe we then have to use the long-term care system to correct that, to support that. So it depends on what you want, and we can use maybe co-payments to do that. There is a question of universality and citizenship. Once you have cost sharing, it does undermine a little bit the whole question of universality and citizenship, and also there are significant administrative costs to means testing. That's just the way it is. If you choose this way, you're going to have admin costs. So I've been working in this area 30 years, and I always have a conclusion slide which is irrelevant. Absolutely irrelevant, because when I say conclusion, people like to think you have a conclusion. I think we're living in really optimistic times with respect to the role and potential of older people. I think there is a commitment both from those working in the system to try to do something different with respect to home care. There's certainly a need. There are huge opportunities available to us to build not just a caring society, but a society that embraces the role, potential and capabilities of older people. Within the care system, it's even more necessary to build a system that embraces the role, potential and capabilities of a person, irrespective of their level of need and irrespective of the stage of disease that they're at. So this is a good time. And it's certainly a good time for us to think about how we need to get resources into this area, particularly in the long-term care area. we're spending more on residential care than home care. That does not mean we should stop spending on residential care. The numbers will simply demand that we have resources available for those people who need to go into residential care. We need to find ways to get resources into home care. And the home care bill coming up will have legislation, will have an important role in doing that. Family carers remain central to the system, the care system. How central do we want family carers to be involved, and how willing are we as a society to support their involvement? That's a critical question for us on the way forward. We need individualised home care solutions. Generic supply-driven solutions are not the response. But we have, in my view, a commitment that that should happen. We have some recent experiments or work done in communities by Genio, which show the value of hearing the voice of people with dementia, for example, in making decisions about their own care. You know, in taking 2 hours of social engagement rather than 2 hours of in-house home care. You know, this is what I mean by individualized care. Ask people what they want. Regulate for what people want. Generate outcomes that matter if you believe that personhood matters, if you believe that citizenship matters. Generate outcome measures for this to happen. I believe that community care services require additional funding. I believe that we need to reinvigorate or certainly reassess our commitment to that funding, whether it's through general taxation or through the potential of social insurance. So 23 years ago, when I was a different person, I wrote a piece on the economics and financing long-term care, where I put these models out there as potential. I remember when I presented this material at a meeting at the National Council on Aging and Older People, 2017 seemed so far ahead on the radar in 1995 that it was almost like it was another country. The time is really short now. We still have time to really do something really, really innovative and supportive of older people. And that's essentially the choice that faces government, but not only government, it faces citizens. Thank you.
Well, I presume, like me, you all feel a lot wiser now. I have a far better understanding about the whole system than I had 3/4 of an hour ago. Yeah. 3/4 of an hour ago was another country where they do things differently. So I just want to encourage the members to access the slides. The slides will be online. Access the slides so you'll have a good picture of the overview. And you also have the paper, so you can read the paper in conjunction with the slides. But I really found that most useful, and thank you very much. It was very helpful. And now we're going to move into private session, where we'll have a roundtable discussion. And I've absolutely no doubt that we're going to come up with an awful lot of hard questions for Professor O'Shea. So we'll resume the public session at 10:50. Very good.